Okay, it's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Timothy Williamson from Oxford University, author of Knowledge and Its Limits, Vagueness, and Modal Logic as Metaphysics, as well as many influential papers on epistemology, metaphysics, and the philosophy of language. The title of his talk will be Ambiguous Rationality. Please.
Right. Thanks very much. So I'm going to be talking about an aspect of our talk and thought about rationality, which I think from a theoretical point of view is rather dysfunctional, although it's probably a product of quite functional heuristics from a more applied perspective. I'm going to be talking about what it's rational to believe, and I'm going to be using rational in the sense of epistemic rather than pragmatic rationality, and I'm not even going to be thinking about epistemic rationality in a kind of consequentialist way with special sorts of utilities for epistemically interesting things like truth or knowledge. I'm thinking of something more direct than that. And a lot of what I'll be saying will really be focused on what you might call propositional rather than doxastic rationality in a certain way. But I mean, I can enlarge on all those things, but that's just some background. So, some of the time when we're talking about what it's rational to believe in this epistemic sense, we're talking about something like what one's evidence supports. So that's something directly about the proposition P and its relation to the evidence. It doesn't in itself say anything about whether one believes P because one's evidence supports it or anything like that. But let's just start off with this notion, because that is one of the strands that is clearly present in an awful lot of discussion of epistemic rationality. And for the time being, I'm going to leave both the notion of evidence and the notion of support fairly schematic. So, my own view is that one's evidence is one's knowledge, but for most of the talk, they're not right at the end. I'm not going to be assuming that, and what I say will be applicable to much more internalist conceptions of evidence as well, like your evidence is your qualia or whatever they think. And I'm also going to be fairly neutral about the support relation. I mean, that could be something very strong like entailment, could be something very weak like just mere consistency, although actually some of what I say would need to be a little bit tweaked if we had a very, very permissive notion of rationality in this sense. And it could also stand for various probabilistic notions of the proposition having high probability on one's evidence or something like that. Again, I'll be less neutral towards the end of the talk, but for most of the time, I just want to leave these notions in that kind of schematic form. So that is one way that we think about rationality, and it's a way in which we tend to apply the notion of rationality to the belief state, the hypothetical belief state of believing the given proposition. But of course, we also talk about agents as rational or irrational. And that plays quite a significant role in our thinking about rationality in general, as I'll explain in a minute. Because often, I think, when we're considering whether it would be rational to believe something in certain circumstances, the way that we think about that is in terms of whether a rational agent in those circumstances would have that belief. So that we're actually, as we're mediating the question of what it would be rational to believe by the question of what a rational agent would believe. So as we're going at, if you like, propositional rationality via agent rationality, something like that. And I mean, one thing to say about this notion of agent rationality is that it typically involves some level of idealization, but not a maximal level of idealization. So, for example, you know, if you think of the question, would it have been rational to believe Fermat's last theorem in 1900, you know, sort of more than 90 years before the Landry-Wiles came up with the proof? You know, a natural answer to that question is, well, no, it would not have been rational to believe it then when nobody had got a proof. But of course, if we were going for and you know, if we thought about that in terms of a rational person, what would a rational person in 1900 have done? Would they have believed Fermat's last theorem? No, because there was no proof. But of course, you know, if we were going for a maximal level of idealization, then the rational person in 1900 would already have thought of a proof of Fermat's last theorem, and so they would believe it. But we're not interested in that kind of extreme idealization. Just another thing I'll note, but in a way it's quite very obvious, that when we're talking about what a rational person would have believed in certain circumstances, the rationality has to do with how they are in those perhaps counterfactual circumstances rather than how they are in the actual circumstances. I mean, usually this doesn't matter, because usually, you know, when we're thinking that if it's a rational person, they would still have been rational in those circumstances. But of course, you know, if these things came apart, if we were talking about a rational person who would have been irrational in those circumstances, then we're not interested in what they would have irrationally thought in those circumstances. And if we're talking about an irrational person who would have been rational in those circumstances, then that is relevant. So that it's rationality is in the counterfactual circumstances rather than in the actual circumstances, if we have to choose. So if you like, it's if we're thinking in terms of counterfactuals, the rationality is in the consequent rather than the antecedent. Well, or actually, it's not qualifying the quantifier over rational people or something like that. That would be a more accurate way of putting it. So we're thinking about. I think we're judging the rationality of beliefs in terms of what a rational agent would have believed. And I mean, you might wonder why we would bother to as we approach the question of rationality of belief in this rather indirect way via rational agents. But you know, I think it might well be that doing that is a way of deploying our cognitive faculties more efficiently in practice to answer the question, because it means that we can bring to bear our capacity for simulation to get out an answer where the question of just the direct relation between the proposition and evidence or something might be a bit too abstract for us to evaluate. And I think a lot of the things that I'm going to be saying about epistemic rationality, I think they do in fact have analogues for pragmatic rationality as well. And in this case, I think even for example, from questions of moral evaluation of acts. I mean, so that if you're interested, in what the right thing to do in certain circumstances would be, you might well try to answer that question by imagining what a good person in those circumstances would do. So, if your paradigm of a good person is Nelson Mandela or something, you might imagine what would Mandela do in those circumstances. Or, you could also even use fictional characters. Supposing your paradigm of a good person was Eleanor Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, you might imagine what she would do in those circumstances. And, that can be quite an effective way of thinking. In the case of rationality, I don't know quite what paradigms of rationality we have. It doesn't seem so relevant to think, what would Tarski have done in those circumstances? But I'm afraid to say I think that what we typically do is we take ourselves as paradigms of rationality, and so we think, well, what would I have done in those circumstances, or what would I do in those circumstances, or what would I believe in those circumstances? And that isn't just a digression. It's that by as it were, imagining oneself into the circumstances, you can, in some sense, use your perhaps rational faculties, as it were, offline to get an answer to the question, whereas they may not, as it were, be delivered to us in a way which would enable them just to directly calculate what would be the rational thing to believe in those circumstances. So there's something functional about this. At least I take it some of the time. And I guess when we're talking about rational agents here, we're fundamentally talking about what kind of dispositions, in particular cognitive dispositions, these agents have. And the natural thing to do in hooking up this conception of rationality with the previous one, the one that just had to do with the relation between the proposition and one's evidence, is to think, well, when we're thinking of rational agents, what we're really talking about is agents that have a disposition, well, in this case, since it's epistemically rational, let's say to believe what it's rational to believe in the sense of the original thing, what I've called the content-oriented schema. So, in other words, to believe, we're talking about agents that have a disposition to believe what their evidence supports. So the question is, what would an agent who had a disposition to believe what their evidence supports believe in those circumstances? And one thing that's going to be important in what follows is just the standard point that dispositions are not 100% things. They're not infallible, except fallible suggests we're talking about agents, but this is something much wider, so that classic example, the fragile vase, it has a disposition to break, easily to break when hit. But if you bubble wrap it, it doesn't lose its fragility. It's still a fragile vase, but once it's been protectively wrapped, then it may not break when hit. But so it's as well as disposition to break when hit is not 100%. But we just don't expect dispositions to be 100%. And so will have the consequence that when we're talking about a rational agent who has the disposition to believe what their evidence supports, that doesn't mean that they always believe what their evidence supports, just that they have this fallible disposition. If we had a very permissive conception of evidential support. I mean, if, for example, I think this would actually be crazy, but if evidential support just meant that your evidence was consistent with the given proposition, because then, as it were, that would leave it very widely open what a rational agent would believe in those circumstances. I mean, crazily in that case, it would mean that they could, if a coin was about to be tossed, they could believe that it was going to come up heads, and they could believe that it was going to come up tails, although presumably not both. And so there may not be just one thing, one state that a rational agent would be in those circumstances. And so you can bear in mind that as a complication, but most of the time, I think just for simplicity, I'll talk as though there were a single state that rationality, that a rational agent would be in those circumstances. So what we've got now is that we've got fundamentally two different standards for what it's rational to believe. There's one which on the handout is given by what I've called the content-oriented schema, what it's rational subscript cont to believe is what one's evidence supports, and then we've got the disposition-oriented schema, that what it's rational subscript disp to believe is what, in those circumstances, with that evidence, someone who was a rational agent in the sense of being disposed to conform their beliefs to what their evidence supported would believe. And the thing is, as far as I can tell, we just jump about between these different ways of assessing whether it's rational to believe something, while treating it as a unitary notion. So that, as it were, we're using two different standards, but in effect, we're not doing any kind of disambiguation, and so we're treating them as standards for the very same thing, some notion of what it's rational to believe. And so that gives us the thing that I've called the equivalence schema, which is just, in effect, saying that what it's rational to cont to believe is the same as what it's rational disp to believe. So that it's saying that those two standards give us the same results. But in the equivalence schema, I've cashed out those two notions of rationality in terms of the right-hand sides. So it says, one's evidence supports P if and only if in the same circumstances with the same evidence, someone disposed to conform their beliefs to what their evidence supports would believe P. And notice that the term rational doesn't appear in the equivalence schema. So that, it's not that by a suitable interpretation of rational, you can guarantee that the equivalence schema will hold, because how you interpret rational makes no difference to the equivalence schema because the term isn't there in the first place. And so I take it that the equivalence schema is a highly non-trivial claim, but it's one that, in a sense, is presupposed by what I'm taking to be our practice of using both standards, sort of, as it were, interchangeably. Let me just clarify what I'm claiming about this and what I'm not. Although I've used the word ambiguous in the title, I did not put quotation marks around the word rationality in the title, as you'll notice, and because I'm not claiming any kind of lexical ambiguity. And in fact, if there were just some lexical ambiguity in the word rational, no harm would be done, because where it's just an ordinary case of ambiguity, we're not generally thrown. I mean, it's not a big problem for us that there are financial banks and river banks, and it's not that. Somebody, if we weren't aware of the ambiguity, of course, you can imagine all kinds of trouble that people would get into. But obviously, there is no such danger, and that's typical of lexical ambiguity, because we have these separate entries. And slightly more subtly, I'm also not suggesting that this is a matter of context shifting. I'm not suggesting that there are some contexts in which the operative standard is the content-oriented schema, and other contexts in which the operative standard is the disposition-oriented schema, because I think it's part of our practice to use both schemas and to, as it were, fuse the results, and not to treat a switch from one standard to the other as a matter of changing the context. I'm also, in saying that we, in effect, presuppose this, I'm not suggesting that people would accept the equivalence schema if it were shown to them. I mean, some people might. I mean, it's pretty obviously the kind of thing that you can't expect a non-philosopher to make much of, because it's all there and philosophers speak. And I think, in fact, it's quite a widespread thing in philosophy that that people assume things such that once the assumption is brought to their notice, they reject it and typically claim never to have made the assumption in the first place. And if the effect, if that's the only way of saving their pride while ceasing to make the assumption in the future, then it's fine by me. But anyway, so I think in these kind of cases, as it were, once it's there as an explicit assumption, most philosophers can see that something is going on there, and that this is not just a trivially true claim. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't, in effect, been assumed in the way that they've been arguing. So the thing I've called the simple-minded argument is, I mean, there's not much to it. That's as it were, a kind of a feeble attempt that someone might make to argue for the equivalence schema. But really, what it does is to assume that that dispositions are always 100%, so that if you're disposed to conform your beliefs to what your evidence supports, then you will believe what your evidence supports. But as we already noted, dispositions aren't typically 100%. So it's a fallacious argument. Okay, so the question is whether the equivalence schema is true. I mean, so far I haven't given any argument against it. I've just said that it looks pretty substantive, and I mean, in a way, the fact that dispositions tend to fail is already some reason for expecting it to fail. So I'll just briefly give an argument for why the equivalence schema is not just non-trivial, but is in fact false, which uses a type of kind of skeptical scenario for non-skeptical purposes that I've used elsewhere. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it. So, and the purpose of using this somewhat sci-fi kind of scenario is because I want something that will apply to or virtually any standard of what counts as evidence. So what I am imagining is a case where there's a machine called a brain scrambler, which when it's pointed at your head and switched on, it scrambles your thought processes. Terrible errors of logic and mathematics strike you as just completely convincing, and any various kind of, as it were, alarm systems that you might have to prevent yourself coming out asserting contradictions and things are also will also misfire. Now, one thing that's crucial about the brain scrambler is that you should not think of it as something that turns you temporarily mad. Think of it as much more like a case, let's say, where you're doing a calculation with pencil and paper, and there's a prankster standing behind you, and it's quite a hard calculation, so sometimes you stare off into the distance, and every time you do that, the prankster nips around and rubs out some of the numbers on the paper and writes in some other numbers, and but apart from that, you're still, as it were, running your same routines for arithmetic as normal. So you've not gone crazy, but the prankster is getting you to achieve all sorts of ridiculous results. It's something more like that, except that it's being done in your brain. And one reason to think that it's not really changing your underlying dispositions is that as soon as it's switched off, then everything is back to normal. I mean, so it would be just as soon as the prankster gets bored and goes off, then there'll be no further interference with your mathematical calculations. Okay, so under the influence of the brain scrambler, you will confidently come out and say things like, 179 is both prime and not prime and stuff of that kind, and you won't realize that there's something off about what you're saying. Now, the thing about this example is, well, take the case where you say 179 is prime and not prime. So on pretty much any version of the content-oriented version, it's not going to be rational for you to believe a contradiction. because your evidence does not support a contradiction. And this, remember, this is a completely overt contradiction. It's one of the form P and not P. I mean, your evidence certainly doesn't entail a contradiction, and a contradiction isn't even consistent with your evidence. And of course, your contradiction does not have high probability on your evidence, because contradictions always have probability 0. So it is not rational to believe this contradiction in the content-oriented sense. But in the disposition-oriented sense, it is rational to believe it, because you're someone with the disposition to conform, to believe what your evidence supports. And remember, the brain scrambler doesn't change your dispositions, right? It's only like the prankster. And so even when the brain scrambler is pointed at your head and switched on, you have the same dispositions as before. And let's, I mean, assuming that the brain scrambling works in a kind of deterministic way, you're simply believing what someone disposed to conform their beliefs to what their evidence supports would believe in the circumstances. Right? So this is a case where it is rational to believe the contradiction in the disposition-oriented sense. So that's a case where something is rational to believe in the disposition-oriented sense, but not in the content-oriented sense. So it's a counterexample to the equivalence schema, and we could easily get a counterexample going in the opposite direction as well, because this will be a case where you don't believe a tautology. You lack a belief in a tautology as a result of the brain scrambler. And so that's a case where it's rational to believe the tautology in the content-oriented sense, but not in the disposition-oriented sense, because someone would, with the relevant dispositions, would lack the belief because of in the circumstances, because of the brain scrambler. By the way, if you're worried about questions about whether it even makes sense to believe a contradiction and so on, it really, using contradictions here is I mean, it's the most dramatic version, but I think we could have lots of other cases as well. I mean, it could be, for example, simply a case where you are forming beliefs about, which of a bunch of job candidates was best qualified, and and as a result of the brain scrambler's interference, you were forming beliefs that were sort of outrageously contrary to what your evidence supported. And I think we could give this a very similar argument in that case. And of course, it is not at all impossible to have beliefs about which job candidate is best qualified that are outrageously contrary to the evidence, as probably most of us know at first hand. So that's a kind of extreme sort of case in which we get counterexamples to the equivalence schema, and the counterexamples there, they don't really depend on the specifics of what view we take of evidence. That's most obvious in the case of the use of contradictions, but assuming that we have a view of evidence that gives non-crazy results in more mundane cases, I think it'll work for that as well. And one thing I should mention, because the argument depends on the assumption that these dispositions are intrinsic, or at least intrinsic enough that they survive the interference of the brain scrambler. I'm not saying that because I'm assuming that all dispositions are perfectly intrinsic. In fact, that's not a terribly plausible view. I mean, for example, it seems that castles became more vulnerable when gunpowder was introduced into Europe, and so that's where an extrinsic change in the dispositions of castles. But we definitely think of dispositions as were much more intrinsic than a lot of their particular manifestations. So that's a kind of sort of in a rather extreme, fanciful case, an example where the equivalence schema fails. I mean, my own view is that it fails much more widely than that, and that it has a whole lot of substantive effects in our epistemological thinking, or maybe not mine, but anymore. But if you take the way that we think about skeptical scenarios, just now, not the brain scrambler case, but more ordinary, I mean, the usual type of skeptical scenarios, are thinking about the rationality and also the justification of the brain in vat's beliefs, on the assumption that it has some, is strongly influenced by the yeah, I know I should stand closer to the microphone. Strongly influenced by this kind of simulation heuristic that we're putting ourselves in the position of the brain in a vat and thinking, as it were, there but for the grace of God go I. I mean, that I would go wrong in exactly the way that brain in a vat is going wrong, and since I'm a paradigm of rationality, then the brain in a vat is doing the right thing. I mean, this is a way of thinking that we find very tempting. It's not just blameless, but it's being positively rational in going the way that it is, and I think. And so one more, at a more general level, the effect of the equivalence schema when we think about these pairs of the good case and the corresponding bad case is the way that we typically envisage them is that as the agent in the bad case has the same disposition as the agents in the good case. It's just that this disposition is, as it were, trying to manifest itself in much less propitious circumstances, and so from a disposition-oriented view, the idea is that the dispositions are the same, and so the rationality in the dispositional sense doesn't vary between the good and the bad case. I mean, what it's rational to believe is the same in the two cases because what a rational agent will do in the two cases will be the same. But then, given that we're assuming the equivalence schema, that commits us to the view that what the evidence supports is the same between the two schemas. By the way, I'm putting to one side issues about content externalism and so on, because they somewhat complicate the issue, but we don't need to go into them yet. And if one's evidence is the same in the two cases, in the good case and if one's evidence supports the same propositions in the good and the bad case, it's going to be very hard to see how that can work unless one's evidence is actually the same between the two cases. Because what you'd expect is, well, presumably if there were a difference in evidence, I mean, presumably the evidence would be worse in the bad case, that would be less of it in the bad case than in the good case, and that you'd expect that there would be some propositions that were strongly enough supported in the good case, but slightly less well supported in the bad case, and in some cases that, as it were, the drop in support would be enough to take them over the boundary between what one's evidence supported and what it didn't. And so I don't think it's quite a deductive argument, but there's very strong pressure to think that one's evidence is the same in the two cases, from thinking that what a rational agent would do in the two cases is the same. And so that's a very substantial epistemological commitment, and of course it's one which in fact I reject, because in my view, your evidence is what you know, and there's a massive difference in what the agent knows between the good case and the bad case. It's just that the agent isn't in a position to recognize that. And just to give you a sense of how this operates in practice, as it were, this kind of reliance on the equivalence schema, I've just put three quotations from some recent work by Stuart Cohen and Juan Comesaña. I mean, not because I have it in for them particularly, but just because it's an illustration of what's going on there. So the first quotation, it concerns a skeptical scenario. Suppose you notice what appears to be a red table staring you in the face. You have no evidence of deception. Everyone else around you says they see a red table, yet you fail to believe there is a red table before you. In our view, you are paradigmatically irrational. Even if unbeknown to you, you do not see a red table. So notice that the notion of rationality there is applied to the agent, I mean, hypothetically, to you, and that by talking about it as what you notice and so on, you're very, very strongly encouraged by the setup to see it from the agent's point of view. That's what it is. So that seems to me a case where they are what they're really relying on is as standard, like what a rational person would believe in those circumstances. But then they also say things like rationality requires one to conform one's beliefs to one's evidence, which of course is the content-oriented schema. And interestingly, they also say that they're happy to grant E equals K for the sake of argument, although I'm not really sure that they are in fact happy to grant it in practice. So that, I think really one thing I'm saying is that that we need to clean up our act in the way that we talk about rationality and what it's rational to believe, that we should be more careful to separate the questions which I'm describing as content-oriented from the questions which are the disposition-oriented ones, and we should stop expecting that those will always give us the same answer. I mean, of course, there's a large range of cases in which they do give us the same answer, and that's why the question, what would a rational agent believe in these circumstances, is quite a good heuristic for what it's rational to believe. But it is only a heuristic, if we put too much weight on it, as I think we in effect do in epistemology, we're letting a massive controversial assumption slip in under our radar. So just a couple of comments to end with. One is that I think that one might be able to get a bit clearer about what's going on with the kind of examples that were being used in David Christensen's paper, if one made more of a separation between these two kinds of question. And since we're supposed to be talking today about fallibility, maybe I'll end with just one comment about that, which is, of course, the notion of fallibility takes many forms. And, I mean, the term fallibilist is often used like, democratic or something that, no decent person would be against it. But I think that it very much depends on what's being built into the notion of fallibility. So if all that's being claimed is that, all human cognitive faculties are liable to malfunction in various circumstances, then I think I'm perfectly happy to grant that. But there's a more specific version of fallibilism, which I think is often treated as though it were a trivial corollary of fallibilism in the first sense, which you find in epistemology, which is the idea that we often know things, even though their truth is not a consequence of our evidence, so their falsity is consistent with our evidence. And if I'm right about the E equals K conception of evidence, then that is just wrong. Fallibilism does not hold in that sense. And going even further, I'm inclined to think that it may well be that the right conception of what it's rational to believe is one, or at least one. And of course, I'm not saying the disposition-oriented one is illegitimate, just that it's not the central one. That there is a good sense of rational to believe in which it's the only things it's rational to believe are things which, or the only things which you rationally believe are the ones that you know, and so that it is not rational to believe anything that's false, because it in fact isn't supported by your evidence. Now, obviously, I haven't given you a positive argument for those claims. The point that I'm making is just that we shouldn't let those claims seem untenable because we're somehow building in the assumption of the equivalence schema into our thinking about rationality. Thanks.
So I'm going to try to push back on the idea that rationality is ambiguous in this way, and in particular express some skepticism about the rational dispositional sense. So I agree with you that there's this important heuristic we use as what a rational person would believe in the circumstances. But I think we have to be careful here because you yourself drew the analogy with morality at one point. And so we can also talk about, say, an honest person and what an honest person would do in certain circumstances. And I think, look, it's part of our notion of an honest person that it's consistent with being an honest person that you sometimes lie, right? So if I start off thinking you're an honest person, but then discover that you lied to your sister as a child a couple times or something, that doesn't make me at all inclined to withdraw my assessment that you're an honest person. And more to the point, in sufficiently extreme circumstances, we think being an honest person is perfectly consistent with lying, right? So if I start off thinking you're an honest person, and then I find out that, well, unsurprisingly, in circumstances in which your wife's life depends on you telling a lie, you would, despite being an honest person, tell the lie, right? So that kind of makes me worried. So, but of course, we wouldn't conclude, it would be a mistake to conclude, it would be fallacious to conclude that, in those circumstances, there's any sense in which telling the lie is the honest thing to do. Although it is what an honest person would do, given what's at stake and the circumstances and everything. And I was worried that a lot of these cases you were talking about in the rationality case look a lot like that. So in the brain scrambler case, couldn't that just be analogous where, because it's such an extreme case, when we think about what the rational person does, so you're wanting to conclude, no, in that case, because a rational person would believe a contradiction, believing a contradiction is the rational thing to believe. And I worry that seemed a lot to me like concluding fallaciously that on the extreme case in which an honest person would tell a lie to save his or her spouse's life, the honest thing to do would be to tell a lie, which I think is not what we want to say about the honesty case, the morality case. And I was wondering, doesn't it seem parallel to the rationality case?
Yeah, so, I mean, you're right that this needs to be a bit further elaborated. But, I think the difference is this. Let me take the case, for example, of, whether somebody has a disposition to keep their promises. And so there will be some cases in which, they suffer a blip and, they behave contrary to their disposition to keep their promise. They just break a promise, because the incentive is great or whatever it is. But there are also cases in which people will break promises because, for example, the thing that appears to be keeping the promise is different from the thing that actually is keeping the promise. And so in those cases, their disposition to keep their promises is active. It's just that because of the unpropitious circumstances, it results in them breaking their promise rather than keeping it. And I think only the second kind of case is really interesting. If we're working with a standard for judging what a rational person would do. And so, I mean, in effect, I've been taking it that the relevant kind of idealization is one so that the person's, as it were, their disposition to believe what their evidence supports and so on is active just as much as ever in the relevant cases, but because of the unpropitious circumstances, it produces the results which don't actually constitute a manifestation in the strict sense of the disposition, and so I agree that it's only that kind of case that will be plausible, as a standard of rationality. But what I was suggesting was that that's exactly what's going on in the brain scrambler case. Is that it's they're doing, they're operating the very same dispositions to calculate correctly and so on. It's just that there are these interfering factors. I mean, it's not like a case where, although they're good at calculating, they happen to be drunk or something like
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So you didn't say this explicitly, but one nice feature of this, I thought, was that it provides a kind of error theory to certain internalist intuitions. Like maybe you're tempted to think that the brain in the vat is rational because you're falling for this ambiguity. So what I was wondering, though, is like, I feel like maybe the extent to which that succeeds as a kind of error theory depends on what the constraints are for this kind of disposition. Like, is it sort of a weird accidental thing about humans that if we were put in the brain in the vat, we would believe that we have hands? Or could you be someone who was disposed, to satisfy the content-oriented schema, but, didn't fall prey to the brain in the vat case, but, went wrong in other sorts of cases? So I guess I'm wondering, like, do you think the particular nature of these dispositions is tied up with having the disposition to conform to the content-oriented schema, or is it just like a weird feature of certain beings that we mess up in rationality in certain cases?
It certainly seems more than a weird feature of human beings. I mean, no doubt any other thinking animal would be subject to the same problems, and it's it's hard to see how there would be even if you had some creature that didn't have anything that was exactly corresponding to a brain, it seems we would expect that there would still be some kind of similar scenario. Maybe just one which kept them intrinsically the same throughout their whole body, but where what was going on outside, assuming this is a being that that forms beliefs about its environment and so on. So I'm happy. Maybe you can just follow up with so given that I'm granting you that this is not some weird peculiarity of human beings that we're talking about. So what's the follow-up, given that?
Well, I guess I was thinking that maybe an internalist would use this as a reason to at least put a lot of emphasis on the version of rationality that corresponds to the disposition-oriented one, because you might think like it's just something about being an agent involves making these sorts of mistakes, and maybe insofar as the notion of rationality is also supposed to play a role in explaining and predicting agents' behavior, like this is just the kind of thing agents will inevitably do, and so maybe our notion of rationality should be constrained by that. I guess I was just thinking, once you thought this was just sort of inevitable for an agent, then you might be motivated to sort of tailor your notion of rationality in a way that doesn't make all agents of this sort come out irrational.
So I think it's, I haven't given any argument against putting quite a lot of weight on the disposition-oriented schema. Of course, the way I've set it up, because I was trying to, as well, I was doing my best for the equivalent schema by making them as close as possible. It does kind of look as though the disposition-oriented schema is in some way secondary to the content-oriented schema. But it could be that for some large range of questions, we might be more interested in the disposition-oriented schema than in the content-oriented schema. But still, I think part of the point of the brain scrambler case is that you will not be able to tailor any notion of evidence such that, or any kind of non-crazy notion of support, such that it will come out that on those notions of evidence and support, the disposition-oriented schema is equivalent to a content-oriented schema. So that, as it were, if you're going to work with any notion of evidential support, then you will still have to make this distinction.
I like the distinction very much because I think that the distinction is super relevant for debates with respect to higher order evidence and also with debates with respect to more paradoxical propositions, for example. What I'm not that sure is whether, so you mentioned quite at the beginning that you're only dealing with propositional justification here, and you're only concerned with propositional justification. And I somehow think that the dispositional-oriented schema is very tied to the doxastic justification notion of rational belief.
Actually, I agree with that. So, yeah, I mean, so to have those dispositions, I mean, in practice, you're not going to be able to have that disposition if the, as it were, the more doxastic bit isn't working properly. Yeah. So the claim that we're talking about about propositional rationality, that was really to do with the notion of one's evidence supporting P, and which is kind of embedded in the dispositional one as well. But I mean, I totally agree that having the disposition will require the more doxastic sort of thing to be working properly, or in practice. Yeah.
Okay, and for example, so I somehow plugged it in this doxastic justification thing and this dispositional thing. And that's why I thought about, for example, more paradoxical propositions where people would say, like Declan's Smeaton's, for example, you have evidential support for a more paradoxical proposition, that's possible, but no rational being would base the belief in an adequate way so that the rational being would believe it. So that's also kind of showing that there are two notions, and it's somehow related to this here.
Yeah. So.
And the same with self-destroying prophecies, for example. You might have evidential support, but yeah, never.
Yeah. I mean, so specifically on the more paradoxes, of course, I think that the evidence, it can't, on my own view, the evidence can't support it enough for knowledge, and so it won't be rational to believe it. But something I should say, which is, I think in the end, this conception of what it's rational to believe is not. It's a bit misleading because, of course, the fact that one's evidence supports P doesn't mean that there is a situation in which you rationally believe P, but because it might be that somehow believing P does change your evidence, and I think there are all sorts of cases that are like. In fact, I took, since I think you heard one of my Whitehead lectures. I mean, I did. There are cases that I talked about there which are relevant to that, and so. Well, I mean, simply as a stipulative definition, it's okay, but it is quite misleading in a way, because it suggests that there's going to be some nearby situation where you rationally, at least if you're not crazy, that you rationally believe P on the basis of that evidence, and that might not in fact be true, and so I think that. It might be that when one got these things, the talk about rationality into a slightly more perspicuous form, it might be that would force one into a more doxastic way of thinking.
Thank you. So I had a similar question like Thomas Kelly. I was wondering whether the disposition-oriented schema should not really or could be recaptured as the manifestation of the relevant disposition schema, and in reply to Tom Kelly, I think you said that, well, look at the brain scrambler, or what's special about the brain scrambler case is that the people are manifesting the very same dispositions. So I was just wondering whether you could explain a bit more, and whether it's not the manifestation of the crucial disposition, namely the disposition to confirm one's belief to the evidence. That's the thing, that's exactly what's not manifested in the brain scrambler case.
So I think there are two different notions, each of which is sometimes called manifesting the disposition. So, if it's a disposition to phi, then sometimes what people mean by the manifesting the disposition requires that you phi. But there are also cases where you don't phi, but if you like, the basis for the disposition is just as active as before. And so the kind of case, the example that I was giving is that with promise keeping, in the first sense of manifestation, you're only manifesting a disposition to keep your promises when you keep your promises. But there is a second sense in which you can, in a way, manifest your disposition to keep your promises by doing something which, as it were, is the basis for your disposition to keep your promises, trying to produce a keeping of a promise, but it goes wrong, so that what you end up doing is something that may, for example, might appear to you to be keeping your promise, but in fact is breaking your promise. And so for example, another example would be that if a frog has a disposition to eat flies, or to catch flies, let's say. I mean, in the first sense, it only manifests that disposition when it's catching flies, but in this, there might be, in another sense, for example, when it catches, a minute drone that looks like a fly, it's manifesting its disposition to catch flies, even though it's not catching a fly, and it was that second sense that I was appealing to when I was saying that in the brain scrambler case, one was, well, I'm not sure that I used the word manifest, but we could put it that it was in the second sense, it was manifesting the disposition to believe what its evidence supported. Or, in particular, it's manifesting its disposition to calculate correctly, even though the effect in the circumstances was to calculate incorrectly.
Intuitively sympathetic with the distinction between the content and the disposition-oriented schema, but I feel the more I think about it, it's because I have a different intuition about what the disposition-oriented schema involves. And I have an information question. First, who are really the guys, the evildoers, who are conflating the two schemata in the literature? And wouldn't we normally say, if you're looking for an ideal reasoner who is not us humans here on Earth, and neither divine creatures above, but somewhere in heaven, as you said, wouldn't we normally spell out the idea of a dispositional account of this rationality in terms of we not only want reasoners to conform to the evidence, but we also want them to think about what is relevant, what are good questions, what is appropriate to the circumstances of the reasoning.
Well, so in the question, I mean, I gave you a couple of examples of people that, I think are in effect assuming the equivalent schema, like Stuart Cohen and Juan Comesaña. But I think this is it's a much more widespread habit of thought, and so I mean, roughly speaking, I'm gunning for a great mass of contemporary epistemologists, who are internalists about evidence, and I'm not suggesting that one will be able to find a a juicy quotation in which somebody asserts the equivalent schema or anything like that. I would not expect that. But what I'm suggesting is that, two things. Of course, a lot of the discussion in contemporary epistemology is done in terms of justification rather than rationality. But I think, Kern and Comesaña are very explicit that they're using these more or less interchangeably, and I think that's also quite widespread. So that, what you have is, on the one hand, you have a very widespread view that rationality and evidence are the same between the good case and the bad case, and I think you also have this tendency to judge the victims of skeptical scenarios in terms of what you could expect a rational agent to do in the circumstances, and so that you see people moving about between a way of thinking where you're kind of adopting the victim's point of view and thinking, what else is the brain of an vat supposed to think in those circumstances, but where that is mixed in with talk about what the brain in a vat's evidence supports. And so it's as I said, it's not that I'm interested in naming names and and shaming people for this. I think it's just as far as I can see, and of course there's an element of a speculative hypothesis here to some extent, that this is just a very widespread practice in the way that people think about rationality and justification, and that it has these very heavy-duty consequences.
Very last question.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I'll try to make my question very short. So my worry or question is that I agree that there is like an important distinction in the direction we are talking about, but I'm not sure that like this position is the best way to cash out this like the more internalist or like the other side of the talk. And I was thinking that maybe like what is really at the bone of contention, or what makes the dispute here a substantial one, as the issue of factivity of evidence. That maybe that like not the people who for instance share Cohen and Comesaña's intuitions, they maybe will not be like so easy. Like maybe they will not want to phrase their view in terms of dispositions, but rather like to make the debate between these two understandings of rationality or two conceptions of rationality like more substantial. We can say that it is a dispute whether rationality consists in following evidence which is understood in a factive way or a non-factive way.
Well, and by factive, you just mean that the evidence consists of true propositions?
Yes.
Something, because I'm not sure that that's really that's the main dividing line here, because even somebody who has a highly internalist conception of evidence might think that your evidence consists of true propositions about your internal states. And the reason why I think that the notion of a disposition is helpful is because quite independently of any issues in epistemology, there is this strong push towards thinking of dispositions as intrinsic, and so, as it were, at least part of the explanation for the attraction of internalism the way I'm thinking of it, is coming from the idea that, you know, once we start thinking of rationality and justification in terms of dispositions, then the idea is that the brain in a vat's dispositions are the same as those of the brain, you know, that's embodied in the normal way, and so that, as it were, if we start off with a rational agent in the good case, then because the dispositions are the same in the bad case, it will satisfy the same conditions, you know, which are being identified with rationality and justification, so that, as it were, we get a non-trivial explanation of at least one source of the internalism, because, you know, one can easily get into a sort of situation where it's hard to explain why anybody would be internalist other than by saying, well, they find these internalist claims compelling or something. But you know, I think it's more satisfying if we can see how somebody might, without a prior commitment to internalism in epistemology, by certain ways of thinking that are independently attested, might get into an internalist frame of mind. And so that's what I've been trying to do here, amongst other things.
Okay, thank you very much.